Today, we're going to tackle one of history's darkest and most unsettling questions. We're talking about the collapse of German democracy and the rise of the Nazi regime. It's a story that's not just about one man, but about political games, massive economic deception, and how a modern, cultured society can be systematically dismantled from the inside out. Let's dig in and see how it all happened.
And really, this is the question that hangs over everything, isn't it? How does a country that gave the world Beethoven and Einstein descend into absolute barbarism? It's not just about what happened, but how. Understanding the actual mechanics of that collapse, well, that's absolutely crucial.
You know, they say timing is everything. And in this story, you had the perfect storm. On one hand, a nation that was completely broken. And on the other, a political figure who was ready and waiting to take advantage of all that pain.
To really get the Nazi rise, you have to picture what Germany was like back then. I mean, the Weimar Republic was an absolute mess. They just lost World War I, which was a huge blow to their national pride. Then the Treaty of Versailles piled on these crippling war payments. The economy just went into a tailspin. We're talking hyperinflation so bad that people were using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The government was weak, unstable, it was pure chaos. People felt humiliated, desperate, and they were looking for someone, anyone, to blame.
And right into that chaos steps Adolf Hitler. Now, he was an incredible public speaker, and he gave the German people a very simple, very powerful story. He told them, "You haven't been defeated, you've been betrayed, and I am the only one who can make Germany strong again." He gave them scapegoats for all their problems, and in that moment of total despair, a lot of people were ready to listen. So here's the part that is just mind-blowing: the speed. This wasn't some slow, gradual decay of democracy. It was a lightning-fast takeover. We're talking about a matter of weeks. 52 days. That's it.
Just look at this timeline. It's a domino effect. January 30th, Hitler is made chancellor. Less than a month later, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, mysteriously burns down. The Nazis immediately blame the communists. And the very next day, they use that fire as an excuse to pass an emergency decree. And this decree basically shreds the Constitution. It suspends freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble. It lets them arrest their political opponents without cause. And all of that was just the setup for the final blow. And this is it, the Enabling Act. This one law was the official death certificate for German democracy. Think about it. It gave Hitler the power to make any law he wanted without the approval of parliament. He could just rule by decree. It essentially made him a dictator. And here's the scary part. It was all done under the guise of legality. Now, if you want to know how they pulled it off, just look at the numbers from the vote. The results tell the whole story. To pass this, Hitler needed a 2/3 majority, which he didn't have. So, how'd he get it? Well, look at that last column, absent/arrested. Every single one of the 81 communist members of parliament and 26 of the Social Democrats had already been arrested or were in hiding. They literally couldn't vote. Then on the day of the vote, the building was surrounded by armed stormtroopers. Under that kind of intimidation, the act passed 444 to 94. Democracy was voted out of existence. Okay, so Hitler has absolute political power, but the economy is still a wreck. The next trick was to create what everyone called an economic miracle. And on the surface, it looked amazing, but underneath it was all built on a massive lie. I mean, an average growth of 9% a year? That's incredible even today. Germany went from being on its knees to having full employment in just a handful of years. It really did seem like a miracle. People saw new highways being built, and they heard the hum of factories starting up again. And a lot of that money was going into one thing in particular: rearmament.
Which leads to a really big question. If you're spending that much money you don't really have, you should get runaway inflation, and Germans were terrified of that after what happened in the 20s. So, how did the Nazis do it? How did they fund this whole thing without the economy exploding?
Well, the answer is some seriously shady but clever creative accounting. It was a scheme called MIFO bills. Basically, the government created a fake, a shell corporation. This fake company issued special bonds, think of them like government IOUs, to arms manufacturers. So the arms makers get paid, they build tanks and planes, but because the IOUs came from a private company, the debt never showed up on the government's official books. It was a completely secret way to cook the books and fund a massive military buildup with money the country just didn't have.
And don't just take my word for it. After the war, one of the judges at the Nuremberg trials put it perfectly. He called it a swindling venture on a national scale that has no precedent. This wasn't just a gimmick, it was a massive fraud. It was a house of cards, and the Nazis knew that eventually the only way to pay for it all was to go to war and conquer other countries.
So once they had total political and economic control, the regime could finally start putting its core ideology into practice, and that meant turning their twisted racial hatred into the law of the land.
You know, the persecution of Germany's Jewish population wasn't some random outburst of violence. It was cold, calculated, and it escalated in stages. It started right away in 1933. They were kicked out of government jobs, universities, and their businesses were boycotted. Then came 1935 and the Nuremberg Laws. This was huge. It legally redefined who was a German. It stripped Jews of their citizenship. By 1938, that legal discrimination turned into open, state-sponsored violence with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Each step was designed to isolate them, to steal their wealth, and ultimately to erase them from German life.
And this is the real human cost of those laws. This little girl, arriving all by herself in a new country, not knowing the language, she was one of the lucky ones. After Kristallnacht, the British organized something called the Kindertransport, a rescue mission that saved almost 10,000 children, most of them Jewish. But you have to remember, for every single child like her that got out, there were so many more who were trapped as the doors of the world slammed shut.
The Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel really captured the unique horror of it all with this quote. The Nazis persecuted a lot of different groups: political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay people. But that was for what they did or what they believed. For Jewish people, it was different. Their very existence was considered the crime. There was no escape. They were targeted for annihilation simply for who they were.
And that ideology, that belief system, was always heading towards one final, horrifying destination. A phase the Nazis gave a chillingly bureaucratic name: the final solution.
Let's be perfectly clear. The final solution was not a code word for deporting people or moving them somewhere else. It was the Nazi plan for the systematic, industrialized genocide of every single Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. And it was all planned out with the cold efficiency of a business meeting at a conference in a wealthy Berlin suburb called Wannsee.
And to carry out this plan, they built an entire network of death camps, mainly in occupied Poland. These places weren't prisons or labor camps in the traditional sense. They were factories of death, engineered for one purpose and one purpose only: mass murder on an industrial scale.
And the final number, it's a number so large it's almost impossible for our minds to grasp. Up to 6 million Jewish people were murdered. An entire civilization, its culture, its families, its future was systematically wiped out.
And that brings us back to where we started, but with a question for you. The story of the Nazi rise to power is not just something that happened a long time ago, it's a warning. It forces us to ask ourselves, what are the red flags? What are the warning signs when a democracy starts to crumble? When does political anger turn into something much darker? How easily are our basic rights given away in a time of crisis? And what is our own responsibility as citizens when we see it happening? That's the real lesson here, and it's something worth thinking about.